The film opens at Susan Morrow's art gallery, where a controversial and unsettling exhibit features nude, overweight women moving in slow motion, designed to provoke strong reactions from the audience. While the guests engage with the art, Susan stands apart, watching with a blank, detached expression. Her success as a gallery owner is evident, but it's clear she feels no satisfaction or connection to the art or the event. Though surrounded by people, Susan seems emotionally isolated, distant from both her work and those around her. The bold, provocative art on display, which touches on themes of vulnerability, excess, and discomfort, serves as a reflection of her own internal state, an outward display of success hiding deeper emotional turmoil and dissatisfaction. The luxurious gallery space, much like her life, is filled with material wealth but devoid of warmth or genuine connection, setting the tone for the underlying themes of the film. After the art gallery opening, the film transitions to Susan's home life, where her emotional detachment becomes more apparent. She returns to her sleek, modern house, filled with expensive art and luxury, but the atmosphere is cold and impersonal, much like her marriage to Hutton Morrow. Hutton is often absent, both physically and emotionally, as he travels frequently for work. Even when he is home, his focus is elsewhere, likely on his affair, leaving Susan feeling ignored and isolated. In one scene, they briefly exchange words, but the conversation is shallow, highlighting the emotional distance between them. Susan attempts to connect, but Hutton's indifference is palpable. As she prepares to sleep alone, it becomes clear that, despite their wealth and success, Susan's life is devoid of warmth, intimacy, and fulfillment. This deepening sense of dissatisfaction foreshadows the inner turmoil she will confront as the story unfolds. At home, Susan receives an unexpected package from her ex-husband, Edward Sheffield. Inside, she finds the manuscript for his new novel, Nocturnal Animals, dedicated to her. Intrigued but unsettled by the gesture, she begins reading the book that night. As she flips through the pages, her mind drifts back to her past with Edward, and her emotions begin to resurface. The novel's title, Nocturnal Animals, a nickname Edward once gave her, further deepens the connection between the two. Edward's gesture and the novel's dedication evoke a mix of nostalgia and guilt in Susan, making her reflect on their failed relationship. This moment marks the beginning of Susan's internal journey as she confronts the pain and choices that have shaped her life, while immersing herself in Edward's dark and intense narrative. As Susan begins reading Edward's novel Nocturnal Animals, the film transitions into the fictional world of the story. The novel introduces Tony Hastings, a mild-mannered man, who is driving through the desolate highways of West Texas with his wife, Laura, and their teenage daughter, India, on a family road trip. The mood is calm and peaceful as they banter lightly in the car, giving the impression of a close-knit family enjoying a quiet vacation. However, the wide, empty desert roads create an eerie, unsettling atmosphere, foreshadowing the danger ahead. This serene moment serves as a stark contrast to the horrific events that are about to unfold, drawing both Susan and the audience deeper into the dark narrative. The tension in the novel quickly escalates as Tony's family road trip takes a horrifying turn. While driving late at night on the deserted highway, their car is aggressively pursued and forced off the road by a group of young men led by Ray Marcus. What starts as a tense encounter turns into a nightmarish situation as the men harass and intimidate Tony, his wife Laura, and their daughter India. Despite Tony's attempts to defuse the situation, the gang's aggression only worsens. Ray and his accomplices kidnap Laura and India, leaving Tony powerless and alone in the middle of the desert. The scene is filled with unbearable tension and fear, as Tony's helplessness mirrors the emotional devastation that Edward felt in his real-life relationship with Susan. After the brutal abduction of his wife and daughter, Tony stumbles through the desert, desperate and disoriented. He eventually finds a nearby house and contacts the police, where he meets Detective Bobby Andes, a grizzled and determined officer who takes on the case. Tony, racked with guilt and fear, can barely process what has happened as the investigation begins. Detective Andes assures Tony that they will find his family, but the weight of the situation bears heavily on him. This scene marks the beginning of Tony's descent into emotional torment, reflecting Edward's own feelings of helplessness and guilt after losing Susan in real life. The novel's tone becomes darker as Tony begins to confront the overwhelming grief and terror of what may have happened to his loved ones. Days later, Tony's worst fears are realized when Detective Bobby Andes informs him that the bodies of his wife, Laura, and daughter, India, have been found in the desert. The discovery is devastating. Laura and India have been brutally murdered and left in the barren wilderness. Tony's emotional collapse is palpable, as he is consumed with guilt, helplessness, and grief. This scene marks a crucial turning point in the novel, as Tony is left shattered by the horrific loss of his family. The grim reality of the situation reflects the novel's themes of vengeance, loss, and emotional devastation. For Susan, reading this part of the story triggers her own feelings of guilt and regret, particularly regarding her failed relationship with Edward. As Susan continues reading the novel, flashbacks of her past with Edward begin to surface. These flashbacks show the early days of their relationship, filled with passion and promise. Edward, a struggling writer, was deeply in love with Susan, while she admired his artistic sensitivity and emotional depth. Despite their connection, tensions gradually surfaced as Susan grew more pragmatic, doubting Edward's ability to provide a stable future. Her wealthy family, particularly her mother, disapproved of Edward, further widening the rift between them. Susan's doubts and ambitions ultimately overshadowed their love, and these scenes illustrate the beginning of their emotional drift. The flashbacks serve as a painful reminder for Susan of the choices she made, as the novel rekindles feelings of regret and lost love. Back in the novel's narrative, Tony, consumed by grief over the loss of his family, teams up with Detective Bobby Andes to seek justice. Andes, a tough and relentless detective, is determined to help Tony find the men responsible for the brutal murders. Despite his personal suffering, Tony agrees to participate in the investigation, and the two begin tracking down Ray Marcus and his gang. Andes encourages Tony to channel his pain into action, pushing him to pursue vengeance. This scene marks the beginning of Tony's transformation from a helpless victim into someone determined to seek retribution. The partnership between Tony and Andes sets the tone for a dark, morally complex journey toward justice, reflecting the novel's growing intensity and Tony's internal struggle. As Susan reads further into the novel, more flashbacks reveal the unraveling of her marriage to Edward. Initially passionate, their relationship begins to deteriorate as Susan becomes increasingly dissatisfied with Edward's lack of success as a writer. Her ambitions and desire for a more stable, secure life clash with Edward's idealistic pursuit of his art. Susan eventually succumbs to the pressures of her wealthy background and the disapproval of her family, particularly her mother. She begins an affair with Hutton, her future husband, sealing the fate of her marriage with Edward. This betrayal is a pivotal moment, symbolizing the emotional divide between them. These flashbacks, intertwined with the novel, make Susan confront the regret and guilt she harbors over abandoning Edward and choosing a life that, despite its material success, leaves her feeling empty. In the novel's narrative, Tony and Detective Bobby Andes finally track down Ray Marcus, the man responsible for the brutal murders of Tony's wife and daughter. The tension builds as Tony faces Ray in a remote location, leading to a violent and intense confrontation. Ray, smug and unapologetic, taunts Tony, which pushes him over the edge. Tony, driven by grief and rage, shoots Ray in a moment of brutal retribution. However, the violence does not come without consequences. Tony is also wounded in the struggle, leaving him physically and emotionally shattered. This climactic scene reflects the novel's core themes of vengeance and moral ambiguity, as Tony's pursuit of justice leads to a tragic and irreversible end. For Susan, this part of the novel serves as a metaphor for Edward's emotional pain and the destructive consequences of betrayal and loss. As Susan finishes reading the climactic confrontation in the novel, she is deeply affected by its emotional weight. The story forces her to confront the choices she made in her own life, particularly the way she abandoned Edward. The novel's themes of loss, betrayal, and vengeance resonate with her, stirring feelings of guilt and regret. Susan reflects on her current life with Hutton, realizing that her pursuit of material success and stability has left her feeling empty and disconnected. The emotional toll of the novel pushes her to question the decisions that led her to this point, revealing her dissatisfaction with her life and her growing sense of remorse over how things ended with Edward. This internal reflection marks a turning point for Susan, as she begins to fully understand the depth of Edward's pain and the consequences of her actions. The most painful flashback reveals the final breaking point in Susan's relationship with Edward. In a devastating moment, it's shown that Susan had an abortion without telling Edward, effectively ending both their child and their marriage. This act symbolizes the complete disintegration of their bond, as Susan chose to terminate not only their future together but also Edward's last hope of holding onto their relationship. This decision is driven by Susan's growing doubts about Edward's ability to provide the stable life she craves, as well as her desire for a different kind of future. Edward is left heartbroken and betrayed, and Susan is left with a deep, unresolved sense of guilt. This flashback explains the depth of Edward's pain and how it shaped the raw emotion in his novel, serving as the ultimate source of Susan's regret. Moved by the intensity of the novel and reflecting on her past choices, Susan decides to reach out to Edward. She sends him an email, suggesting they meet for dinner, possibly seeking closure or to reconnect after years of silence. The novel has stirred deep emotions within her, and she hopes this meeting will offer a chance to reconcile or at least address the unresolved issues between them. Susan makes careful preparations for the dinner, choosing an elegant outfit and appearing visibly nervous. She arrives at the restaurant, filled with anticipation and a mix of hope and anxiety. The scene suggests that Susan may be looking for redemption or a chance to mend the emotional wounds caused by their painful separation. In the final scene, Susan waits at a luxurious restaurant for Edward, hoping to reconnect after years apart. She sits alone, anxiously glancing at the entrance as time passes. As the minutes turn into hours, it becomes clear that Edward is not coming. Susan's anticipation turns to quiet despair as she realizes that Edward has chosen not to meet her. The empty chair across from her symbolizes the emotional void in her life, and Edward's absence is a final, silent message of closure. He has moved on, while Susan is left to face the consequences of her past actions alone. The scene ends with Susan sitting in the dimly lit restaurant, reflecting on the choices she made and the life she now finds unfulfilling. The haunting realization of her loneliness and regret lingers as the film fades to black. Nocturnal Animals ends on a haunting note, with Susan left alone, reflecting on the consequences of her life choices. The novel Edward wrote serves as both a metaphor for his emotional pain and a final act of closure. Through its dark, layered narrative, the film explores themes of guilt, betrayal, and revenge, highlighting how our past actions can shape and haunt our present. Susan, once successful yet emotionally empty, is now confronted with the reality of her regrets and the emotional void she has created in her life. Edward, through his novel, gains the last word, leaving her to face her unresolved feelings alone. The film leaves viewers with a sense of lingering unease, forcing them to question the cost of the decisions we make in pursuit of fulfillment. Thanks for watching. If you like our work, please like, share and subscribe to our channel.